It was an interesting weekend. I was planning to stream on Saturday night. I actually set up a stream, and then my internet went out. There were technical difficulties with my internet. It's not exactly clear what was going on. I don't want to get into too much detail because the whole world can see this, and matters of one's household are generally not what one should be discussing widely on the internet. But it was a very, very strange technical failure. It wasn't a normal thing where one's internet goes out. And because it was not a normal technical situation, it was not easily resolved. It took us some time. And it took us tinkering around on Saturday, on Sunday, and on Monday to figure out what was going on with our internet. But as of now, it seems to be fixed. The very strange, quirky situation with the internet seems to be resolved. But in a way, the fact that the internet went out was convenient because I got a lot of other work done. One thing I got done is I posted all the videos from our convention. Jeff Young's great speech, the great speech by Keith Preston, the great speech by David Fox of Australia, they're all posted. So the internet, the videos of our convention speeches are all finished. On top of that, I finished writing, I pumped out, and then published this book. Here it is, folks. We're cooking. Is that a thing the kids say these days? We're cooking. We're cooking. We're cooking. I just recorded an episode with Kim Iverson. We just filmed well over an hour discussing this book. I made a slideshow here on this channel. Just a small slideshow about this. It's already well over 6,000 views, and more views are piling in. This topic is hot. And I'm getting podcast requests. I got 3 different podcast requests today. We're cooking, folks. We're cooking. And the Kim Iverson episode will premiere later this week. This is going places. Why? Because John Bolton has been arrested, charged. He had his home raided. They're going to charge John Bolton, one of the top neoconservative voices in Washington, D.C., is going to be charged for possibly selling state secrets to rival governments, conspiring with Donald Trump in the Russiagate hoax. That's big. There's a huge amount of talk in the Trump camp about the neoconservatives, who they really are. There's a huge amount of talk among the left about DSA and where the Democrat Socialists of America, where they came from with Mamdani. This book is on. You ain't seen nothing yet, folks. This is going to be bigger than the Kamala Harris book. This is going to be big. And I mean, we're rolling. We're rolling, and we're rolling because only we can tell this story. There's an important story here. Might seem obscure, might seem like some weird political history, but it's not. It's very, very, very important. It's extremely important. And we know why. And we can tell this story. Generally, when people talk about Trotsky and the neocons, they say 2 things, right? Ever since the Bush administration, there's been talk about, hey, isn't it interesting that a bunch of these people that are in Washington, D.C., pushing for U.S. military interventions, isn't it interesting that a lot of them used to be Trotskyists, used to be communists? That doesn't make any sense. That's weird. During the Bush years, there was talk of this. And generally, you got a standard libertarian narrative. Well, communists are haters of freedom, and the neocons, they want war, and they are taking away our freedom. They're spying on us, Patriot Act. So it's just a conspiracy against freedom. Well, that's dumb. And that's not what's going on. And more recently, we get another narrative, which is, well, those communists are all a bunch of Jews, Judeo-Bolshevism, the whole Nazi thing. And those neocons, they're also a bunch of Jews, and it's a bunch of Jewish, and that's not what's going on either, right? It's not a conspiracy against freedom by freedom haters, and it's not a conspiracy by Jews for Jews. It's not a conspiracy. There is an intellectual trajectory that goes from Leon Trotsky to John Bolton. There are certain themes that were taken along the way, and I'm the only person who has ever written an entire book telling this story. I quote, there's a number of books on this kind of topic, The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stone Saunders, The New York Intellectuals by Alan M. Wald, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James P. Cannon. There's a lot of books that talk about this history, but I'm the only one who tells the entire story from beginning to end. How is it that a group of self-proclaimed revolutionary communists went into being the voice of regime change in Washington, D.C.? And I wrote the book, and it was not an easy book to write. It was easy because I'd done all the research already, so I didn't have to do any research. I'd done all the research, but it was difficult to compile everything, get every book in the right place, quote everything, get it all into a coherent manuscript. And it's less than 200 pages. It's about 183 pages, and I wrote this book. And this book is cooking. This book is gonna be a big deal, and I can feel it. Dan Kovalik is already promoting it. Dan is a friend, but I didn't send it to him, right? He was on my list of people. When I write a book, I send it to different friends. I was going to send it to Dan Kovalik. Didn't have to, because Dan was already promoting the book. As soon as he saw it, he shared it. This is why I hate Trotsky. It is blowing up. I mean, this is big. I'm getting messages from all over the world, people wanting to have me on their podcast. This is going to be big. This is going to be big, and the Trotskyites are pissed, and they're mad, and oh man, this is going to be big. And people that want to know about the history of Mamdani and the DSA, and people that want to know the history of John Bolton and Irving Kristol and Gene Kirkpatrick and the right wing and the war lobby and the Republican Party, this is big. This is big. And it's a story that only our movement, only the Center for Political Innovation can tell. It's our story to tell. It's our story to tell. And it is intrinsic to our beliefs and to what we stand for as an organization. So tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of us. This is the story of the bulk of the people watching in the chat right now. This is the story of the bulk of the people who will watch this tomorrow. This is the story of the dues-paying members of the Center for Political Innovation. This is the story of the people that were marching through the streets of Washington, D.C. and New York City with a big banner that says, "Only peace can make America great again." This beautiful banner, and we just found out that Donald Trump is going to meet with Kim Jong-un. It's going to happen, and the leader of South Korea, the president of South Korea, supports him doing so. This is the story of the people who wrote the Kamala Harris book that made a big impact on the conversation in the 2024 elections. This is the story of the people who led the delegation of the United States to the World Youth Festival. This is the story of the people who stood with the Uhuru movement when their homes were raided by the FBI. That the week after they got raided, we had a rally in Chicago welcoming them as heroes, and raised their case at the United Nations, raised their case in Russia, raised their case everywhere we possibly could. This is our story. And if you are part of this movement, this is your story as well. And I want you to know this story. I want you to know this story, and I want you to tell it to other people, because I want it to be their story as well. We are a special movement. We are the innovationists. We are the city building tendency. We're the people that say out of the movement to the masses. We're the people who say dare to struggle, dare to win. We are the anti-imperialists, and this is our story. Now, I've told it on here. I've told some of this many times. And some of this I haven't told as many times, but I'm here to tell this story because it is your story. It is our story. We are the anti-imperialist movement in America. We are the anti-imperialists. When Uhuru got raided by the FBI, the so-called communists didn't do jack shit to support them. We did. When the USA was demonizing Russia, the so-called communists didn't do anything. We marched through the streets of this country saying Russia is not our enemy. When Trump and Putin just met in Alaska, the so-called communists didn't do anything. We were out in the streets saying we support peace talks, end the Ukraine war. We were in 8 different cities. We are the anti-imperialist, anti-globalist movement in America. We are the Center for Political Innovation. And what I'm about to tell you is our story. So here goes. I was quite young, living in a small town in Ohio, becoming more and more politically aware. I had a mother who was a librarian, had a father who was a biologist. My mother went on strike, and I walked the picket lines with my mom when she and the other librarians in Stark County, Ohio, struck demanding better security protection at the library. As a 4th grader, I learned what a union was. I went with my dad to Quito, Ecuador, where he was leading a nature tour. And I saw a country that was in the middle of a crisis, saw all kinds of starving people. And I was always very interested in world history. Around the time I was 5th grader, 6th grader, I started to come to understand what communism was. I came to understand that until fairly recently, there had been something called the Soviet Union that existed. It was a communist government. And what everyone told me about the Soviet Union was that it just didn't work. Everyone in the Soviet Union was poor and starving the whole time because communists believed that everyone should get paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. And so there's no incentive for anyone to work because they're all getting paid the same wage. And so it all falls apart and communism failed. It's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Every country that's ever tried to have communism fails because you just can't pay people the exact same wage because there's no motivation to work. So it didn't work. That's what everybody knew about communism. That was just common knowledge. I learned this from my parents. I learned this in school. I heard it in church. Everybody knew that communism was this idea that everyone should be absolutely equal, and it just doesn't work. And that's why the Soviet Union fell, and it's just never worked. And everyone was just poor and starving the whole time, and they created, brutal, oppressive governments, and just never worked. Okay. Well, I started reading about communism, and I learned that communist governments don't say that everyone should be paid the exact same wage no matter how hard they work. And in fact, I read the Communist Manifesto when I was in 5th grade, and nowhere in the Communist Manifesto does it ever say everyone should get paid the exact same wage no matter how hard. Never, nowhere does it say everyone should be equal. I learned that communists generally believe that the means of production, the centers of economic power, the banks and the factories and the major industries, should be under public ownership and rationally organized. That we should, have the economy be planned to have good for everybody. That society should take control of the centers of economic power, the means of production. That's what I learned. But I learned that it's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Soviet Union fell. Mao, millions of people starved in China, millions of people starved in the Soviet Union. People are miserable and trying to get out of Cuba. They're on rafts trying to get to America. Just never been successful anywhere. That's what I learned. So, but I was still interested in communism. And I was correcting people. People would say, well, communists want to make everyone equal. I'd say, no, they don't. Actually, they want the means of production to be centrally planned. They want public control of the means of production. But I still accepted this idea that it's failed everywhere. It's never worked. So I got interested in this guy, Trotsky, because Stalin killed Trotsky, and Trotsky had opposed Stalin. And I thought, well, maybe he can explain how some kind of communism that won't be a miserable failure with everyone being poor and starving, how that could come into existence. So I'm going to go read Trotsky. So I went to the public library and I got myself a copy of a book called The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky. And the book was supposed to explain why Stalin was a no-good sellout, why the Soviet Union wasn't really communist, whatever. The first chapter of the book, The Revolution Betrayed, is called What Has Been Achieved. The book was published in 1937 during the height of the Great Depression. The first chapter is What Has Been Achieved. And I opened the first chapter and I started reading. And I read about the huge power plants that the Soviet Union had built, how they multiplied the rate of electrification by 10. And I read about the huge steel industry, how they were the world's largest producer of steel. No country in the world was producing more steel than the Soviet Union. I read about how they produced more tractors than any other country in the world. I read about how they expanded access to trains all over the country. I read about how they electrified the entire country, how they wiped out illiteracy, how they were building modern universities. And I just read this chapter by Trotsky, an enemy of the Soviet Union. Page after page after page of what has been achieved, all of these statistics. And I thought, well, this can't be true. This has got to be false. This can't be true. This cannot possibly be true. Because everybody knows the Soviet Union was poor and starving and miserable, and that's why it fell, right? And that just can't be true. They can't have had economic successes. So I went to the public library. I went back to the public library. And I got the encyclopedia. I got the part about the Soviet Union and the Soviet economy. And I found, amid talk about a famine in the 1930s in Ukraine, amid talk about, computer chips or whatever, they admitted that everything that I had read there was true. The Soviet Union had rapidly increased living standards, had electrified the whole country, had built the world's largest steel industry, had built a huge oil industry, had wiped out illiteracy, had more hospital beds per capita than any other country in the world. I read the economic data that said the Soviet Union had actually had economic successes. It had been successful. And I checked other sources, and I discovered that most books on the history of the Soviet Union admit this, but they lie through emphasis. They say in a couple paragraphs, yeah, sure, life expectancy went up. Yeah, sure. But the point is that there was a famine in Ukraine that was really, really miserable. The point is that Stalin killed this person for freedom of speech. And they just gloss over a huge reality. The Soviet Union was an astounding economic success. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty. An entire country became an industrial superpower. They built a modern educational system. They built a huge electrical, they invented space travel. They launched the first person into orbit. They launched Sputnik into orbit. That thing that everybody knew, communism just never works economically. That's bullshit. It's just not the truth. Some things are true and some things are not, but economic growth is something that one can measure. GDP, gross domestic product, is an actual measurement of economic growth. And according to all of the measurements of GDP, the Soviet Union had huge economic growth rates. The Soviet Union produced cars, produced steel, produced electricity, modernized, paved roads. They lifted millions of people out of poverty. They were very, very, very successful economically speaking. And I just couldn't believe that everybody was telling me something that didn't match reality. There's a quote from Hitler in Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography. He talks about how the big lie is the most effective because people lie over little things. But a big lie, a really big lie, a whopper that just doesn't match reality is something people will be very likely to believe because they just can't believe that someone would lie so blatantly. They just find it hard to believe that somebody would distort reality so blatantly. People will believe that you lied about your age. People will believe that you lied to get out of work and get a sick day. People will believe that you inflated, your life achievements and bragged about things that you didn't actually do. But people find it very, very, very hard to accept that people would lie big, massive lie. Well, the idea that the Soviet Union never had any economic success, just always failed, that's a big lie. The idea that socialist and communist governments have never lifted people out of poverty, everyone's been poor and starving, that's a big lie. It's not actually true. The Soviet Union was 1/5 of the planet, and it was a fifth of the planet that got electrified and industrialized under the leadership of the Communist Party. And during the 1930s, the 5-year economic plans of Stalin had tremendous results. And all of the experts in America, electrical engineers and scientists, were going over to the Soviet Union and studying what they were doing and marveling about it. And all kinds of technicians and scientists got hired by Stalin to help them do it, right? They hired Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, to go set up the oil industry. They hired General Electric to help them build the Dnieper Dam, the world's largest electrical power plant at that time. They built on the Dnieper River in Ukraine. And that, I was just being lied to. And it's funny because that the book that first told me that was written by Trotsky. But at that point, I was a Stalinist because I didn't want to disassociate from the Soviet Union. I wanted to get the truth out there. I wanted to get the truth out there, and I wanted people to realize they'd been lied to, and I couldn't stand the cowardice that I would see in other people. I would raise my hand and I'd say, the Soviet Union did have economic successes, and the teacher or the professor would get nervous. Well, yeah, they did, but they killed millions of people and gulags, so we can't talk about that. We just can't talk about that because there's consequences. There's consequences. It wasn't about what was true and what was not. It was if you were seen as somebody who was praising the communists, you could lose your job. That's what it was about. So it was factually accurate that the Soviet Union lifted millions of people from poverty, wiped out illiteracy, invented space travel, invented mobile phones, raised all kinds of people up. That was true, but you couldn't say it because this is America. We hate communists. Very interesting, isn't it? And that American political discourse was predicated on a lie. And this lie comes up all the time. People say, we ought to have health care available to the people. We can't do that. With the Soviet Union, everyone starved and was miserable. And having the government provide health care is just like the Soviet Union. And so it just wouldn't work. That's a lie. Most countries in the world have national health care, and they're doing just fine. But apparently, we've all been told that national health care is like communism, and communism has never achieved anything good. And I got very angry, very, very, very angry about the lies that I was being told, and that everything in America was premised on a lie, a big lie. This idea that you have to have the free market. People have to be unemployed. People have to be homeless. You have to have poverty amid plenty. We have to let, unemployed people go hungry. We have to, make sure that corporations can make profits, and that, everything in America is predicated on this assumption that the communist system never accomplished anything, never had a single success. That's not actually true. That's not actually true. That's big. That's very, very big that it's not actually true. And so as I was getting older, this became what I believed. And I didn't know anybody. No one in my family had ever been in the Communist Party. No one in my little town. There was a woman in my town who who wrote for the local newspaper, and she had had a boyfriend like decades before who'd been in the Communist Party. There was an old lady at my church, and her daughter had moved to the United Kingdom and lived in England, and her daughter had gotten her a subscription to like a Trotskyite magazine. But like there was nobody, right? I wasn't a red diaper child. I didn't grow up, going to socialist summer camps. I was in a very conservative area, where everybody knew that communism just didn't work, just never had any successes. And I read for myself at the public library basic economic data that said otherwise. And that's why I got interested in communism. That's why I got interested in it. And that's why I became very fired up about it. Because I was angry about what I'd been told. I was angry about the truth being hidden. I was angry about the fact that American political discourse, American economic discourse is all predicated on something that's not true. And then the USA invaded Iraq. Right? 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, we were told that the only reason anyone would be mad at America is they just hate our freedom. They just hate our freedom. Yeah, right. They people around the world, these Muslims, they see that America is just so free, and it just pisses them off. And so that's why, they hate our freedom. And Saddam Hussein, who is a secular Ba'athist Arab socialist, is the same as Osama bin Laden, who is a fundamentalist Wahhabi Saudi. And they're the same because all the Muslims are all the same, right? They're all the same. They're all the same, Ba'athist Arab socialists and Wahhabi Saudis. They're all the same. They're all a bunch of Muslims who hate our freedom. And so even though we got attacked by Saudis on 9/11 and by al-Qaeda, that made it okay to go invade Iraq, a secular Arab nationalist government. And they told us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. And that was a lie. We were all told that weapons of mass destruction existed and that somehow Saddam Hussein was the same as Osama bin Laden, so they were going to work together to blow us up with nuclear weapons, right? It was going to be mushroom clouds in our cities. It was all a big pack of lies. We were lied to, just like we were lied to that communism just never worked anywhere, just never worked. We were also lied to that Iraq was going to attack us, that Saddam Hussein was the same, that they had weapons of mass destruction, that Saddam Hussein was the same as Osama bin Laden. We were lied to about that too. They lied. And my little town became almost a 24/7 military rally. We had to make little packets of candy to send to the troops every morning. We went to so many goddamn, patriotic assemblies. We were told that, during the Vietnam War, people had opposed the war and they'd spit on our troops and disrespected America. So even if you're against the war, you have to just shut up and support the war, or else you're disrespecting military families. And it was, and so, and it was infuriating to me because I knew that no, Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden are not the same. No, they're not attacking us because of our freedom. No, there weren't any weapons of mass destruction. We were being lied to. And that all drove me to be very interested, very, very, very interested in communism and Marxism. Very, very interested. I wanted to find the local communists, if there were any, and I wanted to find out what they were doing. I wanted to get involved. I wanted to find out about Marxism and communism. I was very, very interested in it. I was angry about being lied to. I was angry about the war in Iraq. And I will never forget one of the best and most important days of my life. I was 15 years old. And I went to a discussion at a communist bookstore in Cleveland. And I remember my mom dropped me off. She said to me, "Don't leave the store. Whatever you do, don't leave the store. I'll be back to pick you up after the discussion's over." So I'm 15 years old. I'm in the bookstore. They have a presentation about the war in Iraq. And one of the communist leaders takes a stack of newspapers, shoves it into my hand. He says, we're going to go outside. We're going to sell the paper. And I was like, wait, what? He says, yeah, we're going to go outside, Caleb. We're going to sell the paper. And I said, wait, what do you mean? And I, explained to me that we were going to go out on the streets of Cleveland Heights near this bookstore. We were going to try to get people to pay $1 for a copy of the Revolutionary Worker newspaper. And I thought, you have got to be crazy. You've got to be out of your mind. You want me to walk up to people that I don't know, total strangers, and try to persuade them not to just take a free newspaper from me, but to give me $1, give me actual money for a newspaper. It's got a big red flag on the top of it and a big, red star bayonet logo on it. Are you out of your mind? Are you out of your mind? I thought they were crazy. And part of the reason I thought they were crazy is my family was not very supportive of what I was doing. As far as they were concerned, I was embarrassing the family. I needed to stop talking about this. My brother was always saying, oh, people think I'm a communist too. Can you just shut up about this? Can you just stop saying this? Everybody knows communism doesn't work. And it was a problem. I was being told I was an embarrassment. I was being told to shut up. I was being told to just tone it down, to just go along with things. Stop arguing with everybody about this. Just go along with it. Can't you just go along with it? But there I was in a bookstore as a shy 15-year-old. They handed me a stack of newspapers. And they said, we're going to walk up to people. We're going to try to sell them the newspaper. And I thought, you have got to be crazy. And I walked up to people and I said, I want new information about socialism. I could barely get the words out of my mouth. But I tried again, and I tried again, and I tried again, and I will never forget the first newspaper I ever sold was to a couple. And I was wearing my Letterman's jacket. I was from Orrville, Ohio. I had a red Letterman's jacket. I'd gotten a letter in soccer, and if you lettered in athletics, you could wear a Letterman's jacket. I had a Letterman's jacket and had a big O for Orrville on the jacket. And I walked up to a couple, and I said, we've got a newspaper here about communism or whatever. It was a couple, a man and his wife. The guy was a sports fan. And he said, son, I don't agree with communism, but I see that you go to Oberlin College. So I'll buy your newspaper. I've always been a fan of Oberlin in basketball. I know they're a pretty liberal school. Not surprised there'd be a communist from Oberlin. Paid me $1, gave him the newspaper. I did not go to Oberlin College. I was a high school kid. I was 15 years old. But that was the first communist newspaper I ever sold to a sports fan guy who was a fan of the Oberlin basketball team, who thought I attended Oberlin College. And, it's funny. It's actually very, very funny. It's very, very funny. It's hilarious. But after high school, I moved in with a communist group of Maoist communists. We went out and we sold the paper every day. Every weekend, in the cold, in the snow, in the heat, we were out there selling the newspaper, arguing with people and engaging with people. And this saved my life in a lot of ways. I think about who I was when I was 15 years old. And I think about a lot of the young people I know now who struggle. I'm so thankful for the fact that that happened to me. That was the best thing that ever happened to me. The fact that they made me go out and sell newspapers. The fact that they helped me develop the confidence of my political views. When someone would say, I don't want your newspaper, you're a filthy communist, I'd say, oh, so you support a government that kills millions of people in Iraq, right? You support that? right? I learned to defend my political position. I learned to argue and stand up for my beliefs. I learned to talk to people who I would never walk up to, total strangers, and engage with them. And it was so good for me. I learned political discipline. You know, it's Saturday. It's Saturday. You want to sleep in college, but nope. You wake up. That alarm goes off at 7:30, and you get on the bus and you go to downtown Cleveland and you sell the newspaper all morning at the West Side Market, and you talk with a number of total strangers about communism, and you have a back and forth argument with Eastern Europeans who say they lived under it and it's horrible. And you have a conversation with an elderly hippie who says that they are against the war in Iraq, but they don't agree with communists because they're authoritarian and they kill people. And you have an argument with a religious person who says communists are atheists. And then you come back and you count the money and you put the money in an envelope and you handwrite a report that gets sent to party leadership about what it was like out there selling the newspaper. It's a way of being. It's very disciplined. It's very important, and it's very intense. It's very demanding. And that particular communist group I was around, my issue with them wasn't that they were very intense. They were very, very intense, very demanding. That wasn't my issue. My issue was they weren't very smart. They didn't think too deeply about things. They were very, very much, they felt that China was good until Mao died. Deng Xiaoping was a traitor. China was evil. They felt that the Soviet Union was good until Stalin died. And then after that, it was bad. And they didn't support Cuba, and stuff was happening in the world, right? This was around the time of the Iraq War. Bolivarianism was riding. Hugo Chavez was riding in Venezuela. They had nothing to say about it. And it took them a while, and they finally just said, oh, it's not real communism. They didn't support Venezuela. The USA had invaded Iraq, and I was saying that the Iraqis have the right to defend their country. And I would argue with people. People would say, oh my God. And I would say, what would you do if your country was invaded? I said, if this country was invaded, I know what I would do. I would take my gun and I would fight the invaders. I would defend America from the invaders. Well, that's what the Iraqis are doing. They're defending their country from a foreign power that lied to the world about weapons of mass destruction to invade them. They're fighting for their homeland. I would make that point. And they would say, well, you can't say that. I'd say, why not? Why not? That's the point, right? Is the Iraqis are defending their country. They'd say, no. The Iraqis are Islamo-fascists, and the American government are Christian fascists, and we need to bring forward the new way, the new synthesis of communism. I said, that's bullshit, and that's not Lenin. That's not anti-imperialism. I didn't agree with them. It wasn't a question of not wanting to do the work. It wasn't a question of not being willing to do the outreach. It was that they weren't very smart. Let me just put it that way. Their politics was very, very simplistic. And so I joined another communist group that I found in Cleveland, a smaller communist group. They weren't as visible. You didn't see them as much. I joined the Workers' World Party. And, I sold their newspaper, but they didn't push selling newspapers as much. And they were kind of a, less intense group. And I was actually wanting them to be more intense. I'm saying, let's do more. Every so often they'd have a little rally. Every so often one of the national leaders would come to Cleveland to give a speech, and we would put up leaflets and invite people to come watch the leaders give speeches. There was an older woman who had been a founder of the Workers' World Party. Her name was Frances Dostal. And her parents had been in the Communist Party USA. She had gone to Camp Wo Chi Ka in New Jersey, workers' children's camp. And she had worn a little red beret. She'd been a young pioneer, right? Gone to communist summer camps as a child, right? And she had been through McCarthyism. And she'd been a founding member of the Workers' World Party. And we would meet, she was in her 70s, and we would meet every Saturday or every Friday. My classes in college, they ended at noon. And I would get on the train and I would go down to Tower City Mall, and Frances and I would sit there, and we read What Is to Be Done. And we read, Trotsky's work, In Defense of Marxism, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon. We read Marxist writing, and we engaged. And she talked to me about the history of the Communist Party and the history of the Trotskyite movement and all of this. And I studied this stuff intensely. And when I was in college, right? I went to protests. I sold newspapers. I had a girlfriend and all of this. But then what happened? 2008, the U.S. economy crashed. The U.S. economy crashed. And I am thankful that I was where I was at that time, because, bless their heart, the political group I was in decided they were going to make sure that we understood why the U.S. economy crashed. And Fred Goldstein, this old Marxist from New York City, wrote this book, Low Wage Capitalism, Colossus with a Feet of Clay. What the globalized high-tech imperialism means for the class struggle in the U.S. And I studied this book. I read it cover to cover. And Fred Goldstein came to Cleveland and gave classes. And Fred Goldstein, he gave many lectures and had many videos that we watched on the internet. And we learned Marxist economics, which at that point I had not understood. We learned that capitalism has an inherent problem called overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit. And I actually have a video, thanks to Peter Coffin, who made this great video. I explained it, myself at an event, and Peter made this beautiful video of it. I'm just going to put it on, about, what the actual problem with capitalism is, right? I had never heard this. You would not learn this. I thought the problem with capitalism was it was unfair, right? Well, it's more than that. And here, watch.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. Do you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America, so I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I am going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
We very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right, if you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply irrational nature of the capitalist system.
And that issue, poverty created by abundance, people being homeless because there are too many houses, people being hungry because there's too much food, self-driving cars hanging over our economy like a curse, that is the actual Marxist critique of capitalism, that the more productive our labor power becomes, the poorer we get. And that basically human creativity and intelligence has outstripped the narrow limits of the profit system. We need a rationally organized economy in order to handle human intelligence. We are too good at production. We are so good at making stuff that we can't produce stuff in the irrational profit-centered way. We need a rationally organized economy. We need central planning so that human creativity can continue to lead to great heights. And the financial crisis of 2008 was brought on by the fact that you don't need workers at the assembly line any longer, and that the role of human beings in production has gone down. And as a result, we've got high tech and low pay, and we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made. The classical problems with the capitalist system, right? This problem that the more productive we get and the easier it is to produce wealth, the poorer we get. This problem that drives the American government to bury cheese in a cave to keep the price of dairy high enough, right? This problem needs to be resolved. And what we need is a government of action to fight for working families. We need the banks and the factories and the industries to be rationally organized to overcome the problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, that abundance shouldn't create poverty. Now, that is actual Marxist economics. And I'm very thankful that I was in a party that emphasized this. Most communist groups don't even talk about that anymore. But that's what Marx wrote about. That's what, the Marxist economic theories are really about. It's about this problem of overproduction, poverty amid plenty. And that explains the 2008 financial crisis. That explains why artificial intelligence and the computer revolution is causing an economic crisis, which doesn't make any sense. So after college, I was in Cleveland, and I said, now is the time to build a Marxist movement. But the communist group I was in was pretty dead, and I was having trouble finding a job. I worked at a gas station for a while, got fired because I'm spacey, because I'm just not a very good gas station attendant. I did all kinds of stuff in Cleveland trying to get by. But long story short, I needed to move to New York City, and the party moved me to New York City. Thank goodness for that. I thought I was coming to New York City for a month, but I ended up staying. I've never been here ever since. I've never left. I moved to New York City, and I came to New York City. I came here on my birthday, December 30th, 2010. And, I thought I was staying for the month of January, and I've never left. And it was a great decision to move to New York City. It was really, really a great decision. And when I got to New York City, I was in a communist group in the Workers' World Party, and they didn't trust me. But they saw that I was good at selling newspapers. They saw that I was good at calling up subscribers and getting them to write donation checks to the organization. They saw that I was consistent, that I would come to every meeting, and that I would be there. And so ultimately, at the time of Occupy Wall Street, they saw that, that I was trustworthy. And they had their issues. But one thing that happened, right? This was the middle of the financial crisis, and this was the very beginning of Occupy Wall Street, was, you had the Arab Spring in Libya. You had the Arab Spring all over the Middle East, first Tunisia, then Egypt, then all over the Middle East, was Libya, the Libyan War. And I will never forget the Libyan War, because I was an anti-imperialist. And I knew that Gaddafi had supported the IRA in their struggle for independence. I knew that Gaddafi had supported the Black Panthers. And I knew that Gaddafi was somebody who had stood against imperialism. And I also had written articles about how Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent, and how Libya had built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River. And at the time, there was an oil boom, and the oil prices were very high, and Libya was planning to build a state-run bank, an African bank, and create an African currency for the African continent. And so I was very much looking at Gaddafi as a great anti-imperialist, as a great African leader. And so when protests against Gaddafi began, that were being cheered on CNN, when NPR and mainstream media started demonizing Gaddafi as a brutal dictator, I said, we have to stand with Gaddafi. We have to stand with Libya against the imperialists. I supported Libya because of their record of anti-colonialism, their record standing with the Palestinians, their record standing with the people of South Africa against apartheid, their record with, all over the world, and their great achievements, etc. And I was in a communist group that technically supported Gaddafi. But Barack Obama was president. And the left, the movement, didn't support Gaddafi. And I am still to this day furious about how cowardly and weak their defense of Gaddafi was. They did leaps and backflips to distance themselves from Gaddafi. Right? Oh, it's a bourgeois nationalist regime. Oh, Gaddafi's a dictator. We don't support Gaddafi. Don't worry, we're against the bombing, but we don't support Gaddafi. It was the most cowardly thing I had ever seen. Fred Goldstein and Joyce Chediak and John Catalinato, these shitbags, they were so determined because Gaddafi wasn't cool. They wanted to recruit, hipsters. They wanted to recruit trust fund kids. And Gaddafi was being opposed by Obama, and Gaddafi was, and they were so excited about the Arab Spring, and they had to get to defend Gaddafi. It was just so difficult to do. Alex Jones defended Gaddafi louder than any socialist group did, right? Cynthia McKinney and the Nation of Islam. The defense of Gaddafi was very, very weak. And at the time, I became very interested in Gaddafi. And so I studied the Green Book, which is Gaddafi's manifesto about what he believed in. It was his answer to Marxism, right? Gaddafi was not a Marxist. He was an Islamic socialist. He said he was for neither capitalism or the Soviet system. He believed in Islamic socialism. And so I read the Green Book, and I read it cover to cover. Chapter 1, the problem of democracy. Chapter 2, the problem of socialism. Chapter 3, The Social Basis of the Third Universal Theory. I studied that, and I read the book, and I said, Gaddafi is a socialist. Gaddafi is an anti-imperialist. Gaddafi has built a socialist society in Libya. That's what I said. That's what I said. I said, this is a socialist country. And the Workers' World Party people said to me, no, it's not. No, it's not. I said, well, how is it not socialist? And they said, because socialism means the means of production are controlled by the working class. And I said, well, it says here in the Green Book, in Libya, the means of production are controlled by the working class. And they said, well, it can't be socialist because in a socialist country, jobs are guaranteed. Well, gee, that's funny because in the Green Book, it says every Libyan is guaranteed a job. Oh, in a socialist country, you can't make profit from food. I said, well, that's funny because on page 14 here, it says that there is no profit to be made from food or housing in Libya. I said, Libya is a socialist country. And also this group said China was a socialist country. China was a socialist country. They'd lost their way. They'd strayed from the good way. They were revisionists. They were capitalist roaders, but they were still socialists. So China, with billion-dollar corporations, private sector, unemployment, that's socialism. That's a workers' state. But Libya, where a revolutionary government controls the means of production, where they've got, community assemblies, revolutionary committees in every neighborhood, where they've mobilized to build the great man-made river, where they have universal housing, universal liberty. That's not socialism. But China is, but Vietnam is. That doesn't make any goddamn sense. And I adopted what was a minority position in the Workers' World Party. I said Libya is a socialist country. And this is supposed to be, these Trotskyite groups, they're all about debate, right? You're supposed to be able, they allow factions, they allow debate. None of them would ever have a point to refute me on that. None of them, to this day, I have not heard a single argument from anyone in the Workers' World Party about why Libya is not a socialist country. They never made any argument about it, but they just said it's not. And when it really got down to it, the reason it wasn't is because of the fact that Cuba and China are led by Marxist-Leninists, and Gaddafi is a Muslim. Gaddafi isn't a Marxist-Leninist. That's really all it got down to, right? And that's not coherent. And in Revolution Betrayed by Trotsky himself, he says, look, the political line doesn't matter. You can have a leader that doesn't have the correct political line. Communist governments do wrong things. That doesn't change the nature of the economy. It was a nonsensical argument. None of them had any argument about why Libya wasn't socialist, why China was socialist, why Vietnam was socialist, but Libya, oh no, Libya is a no-good bourgeois nationalist regime. And they were so cowardly in their defense of Libya. We did not do one single civil disobedience to support Libya. I am hurt by this. I'm angry about this. We should have at least taken over a building to support Libya. We should have at least gotten ourselves arrested to support Libya. We should have done something. Ramsey Clark, yeah, he went there with Cynthia McKinney, and Alex Jones was on the same plane, right? And they went there to stand with them. We had a meeting at Riverside Church, right? Riverside Church is a big church in Harlem. And you know why we had a meeting at Riverside Church? Because Riverside Church, the Rockefeller Foundation said, can we have somebody have a meeting about, like, the ruling class needed to show opposition to the bombing of Libya. It was embarrassing. It wasn't a real anti-war movement. The ruling class of America, for optics, needed to have an event where Cynthia McKinney and Ramsey Clark got up and said the bombing of Libya is wrong. And so, like, the CIA practically staged the opposition protest for us. It was that week. We didn't do anything to support Libya. And I swear we had more meetings about, trying to explain to me why Libya wasn't a socialist country than we did protests to support Libya. It was embarrassing. It was cringe. There are articles in Workers' World newspaper that say that, well, the only reason Gaddafi overthrew the imperialists is so he could better exploit the Libyan workers. And that's ridiculous. You think Gaddafi built a mass movement and provided universal housing and education, drove out the imperialists, sent guns to the IRA so he could better exploit the Libyan workers. It was absolutely despicable. But on the day Gaddafi died, October 20th, 2011, I was in the Occupy Wall Street Park. And I found out that Gaddafi had died, and I was heartbroken. And the manner in which Gaddafi died was horrendous. I mean, they sodomized him with knives. I mean, it was the most brutal killing. And sick Hillary Clinton had giddily cheered about it. Yay! We came, we saw, he died. And it was the most awful thing. And I got to tell you, in the Occupy Wall Street Park, there was a division. Some people were happy that Gaddafi died. The Trotskyites from the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, they were happy. Oh, he's a dictator. This is a people's revolution. And the trust fund kids that were getting paid by George Soros, the fancily well-dressed, beautiful occupiers, oh, they were so happy. But who was not happy that Gaddafi died? It was the people from the Midwest like me. It was the kids who rode the Greyhound bus from West Virginia and had scraggly teeth. It was the people who were Ron Paul supporters, who were libertarian, but they thought Gaddafi was building an independent African bank that would be, have a new currency and would not be part of the Federal Reserve Bank system. And it was working class people, white trash like me, Appalachians, people from Alabama and Texas who had joined Occupy because they were mad at the system. That's who supported Gaddafi. And it was trust fund kids and wealthy cosmopolitan New York City intellectuals, people working for George Soros, people sleeping in luxury hotels, people trading pamphlets about workers' revolution from below and queer theory. They're the ones who supported the death and murder of Gaddafi. And I realized on that day that Gaddafi died. I realized that there was something about me that made me different than the left that I'd been hanging out around. There was something different about me. When I first moved to New York City, people would come up to me and they'd say, "Caleb, I love your accent." I'd say, "I don't have an accent." "What do you mean my accent?" Right? And when I talk, occasionally I make what they call a biblical allusion. A biblical allusion. I would say, they tell us that the United States is a land of milk and honey. Or I would say, the Soviet Union were the first people to conquer the heavens with space travel. And every time I made a biblical allusion, the audience full of New York intellectuals, New York City Marxists would cringe. Anything that smelled like Christianity, anything that smelled like the Bible, anything that smelled like religion. And I was so exotic with my accent, right? I didn't talk like this. I didn't go around talking about the capitalists and the Soviet Union. I didn't talk like this, so I must have an accent, right? I talk like most Americans talk. I didn't talk like one of them. I didn't talk about the capitalists and the imperialists and the working class, and we're going to struggle against the Marxists, the proletariat. I didn't talk like one of them, right? I was exotic, right? I was exotic, and I was constantly being put in my place. I was a white male. I had privilege, right? No white person has ever been poor, apparently. Did you know that? No white person has ever been poor. No white person has ever been homeless. No white person has ever suffered. A friend of mine in New York City, an Occupy Wall Street activist, she went to jail for her Occupy Wall Street activism. She talked about how when she got to the jail, most of the fellow prisoners, they didn't understand. They were like, why are you in jail as a white person? They didn't understand that a white person could even go to jail, right? There's a huge class thing, right? Urban middle-class white people who live in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Boston and, L.A. and San Francisco, and Appalachian rural white people from small towns like mine in Ohio are very different from each other. And, but as far as the party was concerned, I was a privileged white man. And the fact that, I knew anything about Christianity, the fact that I came from a family of, the fact that my family had been conservative and all of that meant I might be a bad person. I might be an FBI informant or something. I mean, it was, I wasn't trustworthy. I was one of the bad people as far as they were concerned. And, the fact that I made a biblical allusion when I spoke, the fact that I had my exotic accent, I was under suspicion. And you know what? The people that understood that Gaddafi was good were the kind of people they also wanted nothing to do with. I would say, why don't we write a pamphlet about libertarianism and argue against this Ron Paul stuff? No. Anyone who gets into Ron Paul, they are not worth recruiting, right? No. Anyone who gets into that libertarian stuff, we shouldn't engage with them. They're fascists, right? They wanted to recruit the trust fund kids. They wanted to recruit the hipsters. They did not want to recruit those Ron Paul kids. They did not want to recruit low-income white people like me. Oh, no. They wanted to recruit exotic, Puerto Rican transgender people. They wanted to recruit wealthy trust fund kids from different parts of the city who had, majored in queer gender studies at NYU and were experts on why racist white America is, as far as they were concerned, people like me were the enemy. Right? They didn't say that blatantly. They didn't say that blatantly, but that's what they thought, right? If a black person came into the Workers' World Party office, which happened, right? I was there. A black person came into the office and said, well, I don't agree with gay marriage. I don't agree with that. They'd be like, oh, okay. And they would pat them on the head in this kind of condescending way. If a white person came into the Workers' World Party office, which occasionally happened, you'd have like an anti-war meeting where a Ron Paul guy would come in and he'd say, well, America is a communist government and we need to get back to the Constitution. They'd be like, get out, racist. You're the Klan. You're a fascist, right? It was unbelievable. And of course, Zionism, this is New York City. Zionism is a big issue. They were anti-Zionist and they'd fought in the streets against the Jewish Defense League and all of that. However, if a group of Zionists were saying all Arabs are terrorists, all Arabs should be killed, they'd say, oh, that's so sad that they think that way. However, if a white person said anything that was slightly racially offensive, be gone, you racist, it was a huge double standard, right? There's an ethnic component to all of this, right? There's an ethnic component to all of this. And the fact that they couldn't stand with Gaddafi with any goddamn courage. And they were so desperate to distance themselves from Gaddafi. And they had no desire to unite with the people who did actually oppose murdering Gaddafi. The working class people like me, and I was held in suspicion because I was a working class person, because I was from a Christian background, God forbid. I couldn't be anything but the Ku Klux Klan as far as these people were concerned, right? All of that eventually led to a lot of events that we can talk about. And tonight, I'm not going to get into all of this, right? I'm not going to talk about my trip to Iran and my religious conversion and how I returned to my Christian faith. I'll talk about that on another night. But this is all foundational to what we believe. And that's why this book, Trotsky and the Neocons, is so important. And that's why I want you to understand why this history is important. And I'm going to tell you why it's important. What happened? Leon Trotsky was a leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, a Marxist, who had a falling out with Stalin. And he fled, and he lived in Turkey for a while after he fled the Soviet Union. He lived in France for a while. And then ultimately, he moved to Mexico City. And he built a movement of followers who followed Trotsky. They followed Leon Trotsky. What did they believe? Well, they believed the Soviet Union was socialist in its economic foundations, but it was what they called a degenerated workers' state. It was led by a parasitical bureaucracy, and they wanted to carry out a political revolution to bring Trotsky into power and bring down Stalin. And it appears that they were collaborating with the Nazis. A lot of Trotsky's policies lined up with the Nazis. For example, the Nazis promoted Ukrainian nationalism. Trotsky also promoted Ukrainian nationalism, called for breaking Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. The fascists and the Nazis were fighting against the Spanish Republic. Well, Trotsky also, his followers in the POUM, the Workers' Party of Spain, they staged an uprising to try and overthrow the Spanish Republic, and apparently received funding from the Nazis to do it, whether they knew it or not. The communists built a united front with Roosevelt because Roosevelt was anti-fascist. Trotsky, on the other hand, was prepared. They invited him to come testify against Roosevelt. When Congress was investigating Roosevelt for his ties to the Communist Party, Trotsky was invited to testify before the Dies Committee, accusing Roosevelt of being soft on communism, having an inappropriate relationship with the Communist Party. He agreed to testify before the Dies Committee. They rescinded his invitation, but he was prepared to speak at a congressional testimony against the Communist Party for the Republicans because Roosevelt was aligning with the Soviet Union. Trotsky it appears that for his own self-serving reasons, because he had a falling out with the Soviet leadership, he was being boosted to some degree or other by Hitler and supporters of Hitler, right? That, Mussolini published his book and distributed it all across Italy. In addition to that, William Randolph Hearst, the, fascist sympathizing newspaper tycoon, published Trotsky's articles about why Stalin was bad, why the Soviet Union was going to fall. Trotsky, for his own selfish, opportunist reasons, was being boosted by the Nazis and was kind of helping the Nazis. And when France was invaded by the Nazis, he condemned the Communist Party for trying to build a patriotic resistance to the French and to the Nazi invaders. He said, "Plague on both your houses." And Trotsky was ultimately assassinated by a Soviet agent because of the fact that his followers were going to try and mobilize the labor movement against the fight against Hitler. When World War II was breaking out, the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party were thrown in prison. They were conspiring to try and unionize the U.S. military to disrupt the war effort. And Trotsky was going to try and mobilize working class people in the Allied countries to oppose the fight against Hitler. And Stalin said, "We can't have that." So, an ice pick was lodged into his skull. And, Trotsky was pretty brutally killed because he was considered to be an asset of the Nazis. He was considered to basically be on the side of the Nazis. And that's who Trotsky was. But in 1939, Trotsky did a zigzag. What happened in 1939? In 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact, a temporary non-aggression pact. And Trotsky said, "Woohoo!" Yeah, and he supported it, right? And that's little known history. Trotskyites try to cover that up, but he did not oppose it. He said they did it in an unprincipled way. He says they didn't do it, they should have explained it, whatever, but he supported it. And Trotsky even wanted his followers in America to endorse the Communist Party, the Stalinists, in the 1940 election. And he wanted to build an anti-war movement at that moment. Trotsky was very excited when Stalin and Hitler had their temporary non-aggression pact. Well, who wasn't excited about it? The New York intellectuals, Max Shachtman, James Burnham, and Martin Aburn, as well as Irving Howe and Irving Kristol, Mary McCarthy, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Carl Gershman. These people, they were horrified. Right? They were fine being radical, right? It was quite trendy in New York City to be a communist. Roosevelt was the president. The Communist Party controlled 2 of the city council seats. They had Vito Marcantonio in the House of Representatives. The Communist Party was like a New York City institution. Roosevelt was the president. He was aligned with them. But then when the Pact of 1939 happened, U.S. media went into an anti-Soviet overdrive, and it played up the idea, oh no, the Soviet Union are a bunch of hypocrites. They're building an anti-fascist front. Now they've signed a pact with the Nazis. They're hypocrites. Earl Browder, leader of the Communist Party, is thrown in prison. And all of a sudden, to defend the Soviet Union is not a popular thing in America. Mainstream media calls the communists the communazis. The communists are considered to be no good because they would sign this pact with Hitler. Well, in that atmosphere, Max Shachtman and James Burnham and Martin Aburn and Irving Kristol and all of them said, we don't want to be supporting the Soviet Union anymore. Trotsky says it's a deformed workers' state. It's not a deformed workers' state. Oh, no. It's bureaucrat collectivism. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are this new system we've invented called bureaucrat collectivism. It's neither socialist or capitalist. It's this new system that's bad called bureaucrat collectivism. It's worse than capitalism, they said. And some of them said, well, it's actually state capitalism, right? The Soviet Union is a capitalist economy, and the Communist Party are the new capitalists, and they run the capitalism through the state. And they made all kinds of excuses, and some of them didn't even disagree about the nature of the Soviet Union. They disagreed with the canon regime. This is very interesting and very important. The cult of the leader, right? That's what they disagreed with, the cult of the leader. And they said, we don't want to follow orders from Moscow or from Mexico City. We want to think for ourselves. Cult of the leader, cult of personality, the canon regime, the leader of the U.S. Trotskyist party was a guy named James Cannon. And they said it's a cult of personality. James Cannon is authoritarian and we can't have this. It's a cult of the leader. He's demanding that we practice party patriotism. We need to be, loyal to this party, and we're not loyal to the party. And so there was a big fight. And the Yipsels, they were called, the Young People's Socialist League of New York, YPSL, the Yipsels quit and they were kicked out. And in 1939, there was a split in the Fourth International. And the Trotskyist movement split between the followers of Trotsky and the Fourth International and the third camp Trotskyites, the Shockmanites, the Yipsels, whatever you want to call them, the New York intellectuals is what Trotsky called them. And Trotsky wrote a big book arguing against them called In Defense of Marxism. And James Cannon wrote a big book arguing against them called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. And they said it's about class. It's about class. These people, they are middle-class intellectuals. And for the sake of their careers, for the sake of whatever, they can't bring themselves to go against U.S. imperialism. And continuing to defend the Soviet Union as a workers' state, supporting the Pact of 1939, that put them at odds with U.S. imperialism. And they weren't willing to do that. They were cowards. And having, it was fine as long as being a communist, being ultra radical seemed like you were in line with Roosevelt, fine. But when your position was at odds with U.S. imperialism, all of a sudden they couldn't do it. And so in 1939, they quit and they formed their own group, the Workers' Party, and they had the Young People's Socialist League. They had Partisan Review magazine. They had Labor Action magazine. They had their own group. Fast forward to a decade later, 1949. What's happening? McCarthyism. The Communist Party's leaders are thrown in prison. The FBI is going after the Communist Party. The Communist Party was very popular. It was in with the Roosevelt administration. But after World War II, Roosevelt is dead. And the Communist Party is public enemy number one. And these people are having a field day. They hate the Communist Party and they're denouncing the Communist Party and all this. Well, 1949, the Communist Party of the United States did something utterly amazing. And I am just in awe of them. And you don't know how big of a deal it was. 1949, they sponsored the Scientific and Cultural Conference for World Peace at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City. And they picked that location because UN officials could come to it, right? And that enabled them to allow various Soviet people to come. Shostakovich, the great Soviet composer, came. Various famous Soviet novelists came. Albert Einstein came as well. Will Geer, the actor, came. Aaron Copland, the beautiful composer, came. Arthur Miller, the playwright, came. Lillian Hellman, the playwright and novelist, she came. And that all kinds of great American intellectuals gathered at the Waldorf Hotel to have an anti-imperialist event. W.E.B. Du Bois, the well-respected African-American scholar, spoke. And the Communist Party pulled it off. They because of the United Nations and the Soviet Union being a permanent member of the United Nations, and because the Waldorf Hotel is close to the United Nations, and because of one thing, they were able to do this event. And it was a miracle. And the FBI stood at the door and took a picture of every person who went in. Seriously, I'm not making that up. And the New York Times denounced it, and there were thousands of people outside, calling it out. And they had 3,000 people attend this beautiful conference in New York City to support the Soviet Union. The New York City, the Waldorf Peace Conference, the Scientific and Cultural Conference for World Peace. And it was a great achievement. And they did it with the FBI breathing down their necks. And I mean, it was a level of courage. I mean, it shows you. I mean, they barely pulled it off. There were a couple of Canadians who came to the conference. They just came to the conference. People from Canada. They came over the border. They came to the conference. And the first night of the conference, the FBI broke into their hotel rooms and dragged them out and deported them from the United States because they were foreigners who'd gone to this conference. So they must be communists, and kicked them out of the country. I mean, it was like to do what they did. The Waldorf Peace Conference was a huge, huge achievement. And of course, Max Shachtman and Martin Aburn and James Burnham and all of them, they don't want anything to do with that. Oh my God, they are horrified. So they formed the Committee for Cultural Freedom. and it was going to oppose this Stalinist conference, right? And they were going to have their own conference that was against the Soviet Union and against, McCarthyism in America. And they were going to protest the conference and make clear that they didn't support it. And Sidney Hook comes together and he forms his Committee for Cultural Freedom. And he goes to the FBI and the CIA and he says to them, give me $100 million and I will create a democratic movement that will bring down the Soviet Union, right? And I can beat the communists at their own game. And he forms the Committee for Cultural Freedom. And the Committee for Cultural Freedom, they go into the conference and they have this whole plan. They bring umbrellas and they're not going to let them speak and they're going to bang their umbrellas. And when they come into the conference, they're greeted. The Communist Party leaders greet them at the door and they say, welcome. And they say, you can all speak. We'll give you 2 minutes to speak. And they're like taken aback. And they all had 2 minutes. They gave them the floor, the Trotskyites. And so, they got up and they confronted Shostakovich, the great Soviet musician. We have a communist newspaper from Pravda that says that certain music, that's decadent, this Western music should be outlawed in the Soviet Union. What do you think of that? Shostakovich said, I agree. And they confront a famous Soviet novelist. Your novel, before it was mass produced in the Soviet Union, had to be reviewed by the Communist Party committee. Isn't that awful? What do you think of that? And he said, well, they had good suggestions. I think they improved it, actually. And another speaker gets up and talks about how the Soviet Union and the American people have a similar spirit and says that, Lenin was mobilizing the masses of people to fight and believed in popular power. And that's very similar to Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Mary McCarthy gets up. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he believed in, the power of the human will and he believed in idealism. He didn't believe in dialectical materialism. Do you think the Soviets would let him move to the Soviet Union? They would ban him from coming there. And the speaker responds and he says, that's the non sequitur of the year because all kinds of people are banned from entering the United States because they might be communists, including a lot of people who tried to come to this conference who had their visas blocked. And everyone laughs, they came in and they made a scene. They tried to put on a show and the communists gave them the platform and they walked out very disappointed. And the cultural conference at the Waldorf Hotel was a big success that the Communist Party pulled off. They got all these great people to speak up in support of peace. They even let the New York intellectuals, the Trotskyites, get up and make their point. And so what happens? Well, one of the main organizers of the conference is a guy named Howard Fast. Howard Fast is an American novelist, and he wrote a novel called Spartacus, and Little Brown Publishing Company was going to publish it. And so after the Conference for World Peace, the FBI showed up at Little Brown Publishing. And they said, we don't want you to publish this Spartacus novel. It's communist propaganda. And J. Edgar Hoover personally would be really upset if you published this novel. And so Little Brown Publishing said, we're sorry. And they pulled their contract and they didn't publish Spartacus by Howard Fast. Exactly what they accused the communists of doing. Exactly what the Committee for Cultural Freedom was saying, that's why the Soviet Union is bad. That happened in America the week after the conference. The week after the conference, the FBI went to Little Brown Publishing and said, no Spartacus novel. And a novel about ancient Greece was banned by the FBI as retaliation for this peace conference at the Waldorf Hotel. You cannot make this stuff up. Well, the Committee for Cultural Freedom started getting funded by the CIA. And Partisan Review magazine, which was this Trotskyite magazine, suddenly it blew up and it was on every college campus ever. And it was out there and it said it was against McCarthyism, said it was against militarism, but it was also very vicious to people that would defend the Soviet Union. They launched a campaign against Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein's a smart physicist, but he's an apologist for the Stalinist regime and called out Albert Einstein. Waged a campaign against Lillian Hellman, the great playwright. She's a nice playwright, but she's a Stalinist and she's defending the Soviet Union. Just tried to destroy her career, tried to get her speaking engagements canceled. They went after W.E.B. Du Bois. He says he cares about black people, but the Soviet Union is just using him, and the Soviet Union is racist too and anti-Semitic. They go after W.E.B. Du Bois. It's a cancel culture campaign. Partisan Review magazine. They set up Encounter magazine in Britain. They set up Der Monat magazine in Germany. Theodor Adorno becomes popularized, right? Theodor Adorno, the great, Frankfurt School Marxist, is pumped by Der Monat, the German wing of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And they promote Susan Sontag. And there, pretty soon it becomes clear that what the CIA and the Trotskyites who work for the CIA are doing, they're not just promoting Trotskyism. They're not just promoting anti-Stalinist leftism. Oh, no. What else are they doing? They're talking about individualism. First of all, they start funding the art galleries of Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock, who splatters paint on a canvas. Jackson Pollock. And they say that's freedom. And the Soviet Union, they have socialist realist art, and Roosevelt promoted socialist realist art, but freedom is just splattering paint on a canvas. And they start promoting experimental music, right? No more of this romanticism, no more Beethoven, no more Shostakovich. No. We need experimental music that makes you feel weird. And they like art that makes you feel disorganized and disoriented. They like art that throws you off and makes you confused. And they don't like art that makes you feel confident. They don't like art that makes you feel proud of yourself. And in fact, they decide that kind of art is fascist, right? Susan Sontag writes about fascinating fascism. Physical fitness is fascist. The cult of physical fitness, the cult of physical awareness, all of this is fascist. Fascinating fascism. Gymnastics is fascist, and mass movements are fascist. And Hannah Arendt is sent to Israel when Adolf Eichmann is on trial. And she writes a whole book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, the study of the banality of evil. This guy, Adolf Eichmann, he's a Nazi war criminal, but he's just an ordinary man. He's just like everybody else. And deep down, Adolf Eichmann is just an ordinary person, because deep down, ordinary people are Nazis. Average people are hateful, bigoted anti-Semites deep down, and that's why, Israel needs to exist to keep the Jews safe from the evil, hateful people. That deep down, all the European people, all the Americans, we're all just a bunch of Adolf Eichmanns deep down, and that's why you need Israel, and that's why we need nonconformity, the banality of evil, the ordinariness of evil. That's the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this is the Shachtmanites, the followers of Max Shachtman, that have been employed by the CIA, that are getting funded and they're getting their careers boosted by the CIA. They create a whole new political movement. It's called the New Left. The New Left, the cultural revolution of the 1960s. It's not for the Soviet Union, but it's not for the West either. It's about nonconformity and free thinking and deconstruction and postmodernism, right? This is the trajectory. This is why this stuff is important. This is a big deal, what I'm telling you about. It's not meaningless. But then what happens? The Black freedom struggle gets going. The civil rights movement, which these folks all supported, they liked Martin Luther King Jr., they liked the civil rights movement, but the civil rights movement gives birth to the Black liberation movement. And out of the Black liberation movement, you get the Black Panthers, who admire Mao and admire Gaddafi and admire the Soviet Union, admire China, and send delegations to North Korea. And out of the campus anti-war movement, which they kind of supported, they had mixed feelings about the Vietnam War. You get Students for a Democratic Society, and you get people running around waving the flag of the Vietnamese and saying the Vietnamese people are right to oppose the U.S. imperialists. And all of a sudden, right, out of the New Left, you have a layer of people that are Stalinists, and God forbid, many of them are against Israel. They're supporting the Palestinians. Many of them, and they're waving the Palestinian flag. Oh my God, we can't have this. So starting in 1972, some of them a little bit earlier, Irving Kristol becomes a supporter of Richard Nixon. He says, and the New Left is out of control. They're just not anti-communist enough. And when George McGovern is chosen to be the Democratic Party candidate in 1972, Max Shachtman, he had been supporting Henry Jackson. He'd been supporting Hubert Humphrey. But when George McGovern got the nomination for the Democrats, he voted for Richard Nixon, because George McGovern is too soft on the commies. He's too soft on the Stalinists. And these people are supporting the Vietnam War, and they're supporting Republicans because, my goodness, those communists, the Black Freedom Struggle and the Vietnamese Liberation Front, they're so dangerous. And a layer of the new left, not all of them. Michael Harrington remained a leftist, a Democrat, set up DSA. Irving Howe remained a Democrat, set up DSA. The Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee is the ones who stayed with the Democrat Party. But some of them became Republicans. Irving Kristol became a Republican. And so did Max Shachtman. And so did a layer of them. And Carl Gershman goes on to be the head of the National Endowment for Democracy. Jean Kirkpatrick, who's a Yipsel, has joined the Yipsels, works with Max Shachtman. She ends up becoming a Republican, and she ends up being the United Nations ambassador for Ronald Reagan. She worked with Shachtman. And it's weird because Max Shachtman is this figure that, like, all across the American political spectrum, you find followers of him. Richard Perlman, right? Richard Pearl, who was the head of the U.S. Information Agency under Bill Clinton, follower of Max Shachtman, member of Yipsel, right? George Meany, head of the AFL-CIO. Max Shachtman is his personal advisor. Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King Jr.'s top advisor, follower of Max Shachtman, right? You go down the line, CLR James, right? He worked closely. He was a Shachtmanite, was in the Shachtman faction of the Trotskyite movement, right? On the left, on the right, the people who set up DSA, the people who set up the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl Gershman, the people who set up the neocon think tanks and promoted U.S. regime change wars, Irving Kristol, you go down the line, they're all connected back to Max Shachtman, this obscure American Marxist. What in the world is going on here? How is it that, the hard Republican war hawks of the 80s and 90s up into the Bush years, how is it that they trace their lineage back to Trotsky? What's the continuity? Well, you can find an answer to that when you go to the work of Leo Strauss, right? Leo Strauss was never a Trotskyist, but Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor who became friends with them, became very close to Irving Kristol, became very close to Susan Sontag and others. Leo Strauss, he wrote Persecution in the Art of Writing. And he argues that all the great philosophers of history have written in code because the masses would persecute them if they learned what they, really believed. And that all the great philosophers have had to write in code, and that some people are just naturally better than others. They're the philosopher kings. And that it's okay to lie. The noble lie. It's okay to lie to the masses of people because they're too stupid and they can't understand it. And that it's okay to lie to them. And his favorite TV show is Gunsmoke, a cowboy TV show from the 1950s where the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good. The bad guy wears a black hat and he's all bad. And he says, this is how average Americans need to understand politics. And that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are both examples of excessive democracy. When average people get too involved in politics, they turn into bloodthirsty authoritarians. They turn into bloodthirsty anti-Semitic authoritarians. And so we need to do everything we can to control the masses of people and dumb them down and lie to them and keep them in their place so that we, the philosopher kings, the natural superiors, can rule over everybody else. That's what Leo Strauss believes. Irving Kristol believes that too. Susan Sontag believes that too. She says communism is nothing but the most effective form of fascism, right? And this is what they believe, right? That they are the intellectual elite and that the United States is on a mission to spread freedom around the world, to protect the great intellectuals and make sure that governments like Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, like any kind of government that would get in their way, like Gaddafi's Libya, like China, like whatever, any government that would get in their way has to be overthrown. And the USA is on a mission to spread freedom around the world. And if we have to tell noble lies to do it, that's okay. And we need the dumb average Americans to think it's a cowboy movie, to think it's, it's a cowboy movie. It's, that's what we need average Americans to think. That's what we need. And that's the neocon perspective. Where is the continuity? Well, let's go back to the Bolsheviks. Let's go back to Lenin. The time that Lenin wants to form his Bolshevik party, his party of a new type, Trotsky doesn't agree with it. Right? In 1912, the Bolsheviks are expelling people and forming their own organization. Trotsky says, no, I'm not going to join the Bolsheviks. I'm going to form the August Bloc. And what is the August Bloc? The August Bloc is this centrist organization. It's going to be the radical wing of social democracy. And who joins the August Bloc? The Jewish Bund of Russia. And who are the Jewish Bund? Well, the Jewish Bund are a group of Russian Marxists, socialists who are Jewish. And they say we can't form a regular communist party because we're Jews, right? And Russian non-Jews are so anti-Semitic, and we are just so special. We have to have our own communist group. And Lenin, also himself Jewish, says that's stupid. And he calls that the spirit of the ghetto. The spirit of the ghetto. What is the spirit of the ghetto? He says this idea that Jews are just so separate and so different and that they can't possibly integrate into European society, this is toxic. And Lenin says we want nothing to do with this, and that Zionism is the logical conclusion of it, right? The idea that then we have to have our own state, right? And that the Jewish Bund, they're not Zionists, but it's still the spirit of the ghetto, and that the road to ending anti-Semitism is assimilation. Jews have to join arm in arm with non-Jews and form a movement for the good of their countries. Well, Trotsky, he's not willing to join with Lenin, and he's working with the Jewish Bund to form the August Bloc. Well, what eventually happens? Trotsky eventually, he joins the Bolsheviks. He repudiates his position. But after the Russian Revolution, he maintains this belief that peasants are inherently backward. He says that they need permanent revolution. The Soviet Union should only exist as a temporary holdout to spread Marxism to the West where it really counts. Well, that doesn't go over. He flees. He builds his movement. And, in the final years of his life, right? The final year of his life before he dies, he writes a book about Stalin, an appraisal, a biography of Joseph Stalin. And what does he write about Stalin? He writes that the first 5 pages of the book are that Stalin is Asiatic. He's not white. He's Asian. And Asian people are just inherently authoritarian and despotic. And that Stalin is an Asiatic. And he's like Genghis Khan. Go and read the first 5 pages of Stalin's biography of Trotskyism. And you tell me that that's not anything but racism. It's called racism. He baits Stalin over the fact that he's born in Georgia. He baits Stalin over the fact that he went to seminary school. And he basically says the West is the best. The West is the best. And Stalin is an Asiatic. Stalin is like those peasants. Stalin is like those Russian Orthodox priests and nuns and monks who trained him. Stalin is Genghis Khan. Stalin's Asiatic. Stalin's Eastern. He doesn't have good Western values. That's what Trotsky says. Trotsky was a racist, folks. He thought the West was the best. He was a self-hating Russian. He was born in Kherson, but as far as he was concerned, New York City was the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. That's an actual quote from his autobiography. He hated the East. Lenin had formed the Bolsheviks and said the revolutionary energy is in the colonized world. It's the sections of the world that have been kept under the domination of Western imperialist finance and the big monopolies fighting for their national liberation. That's where the revolution is going to come from. Trotsky says, oh no, the West is the most advanced. The only socialism he wants to be a part of is a socialism of the Western industrial workers fighting to seize their factory. His socialism is a continuation of the French Revolution and the ideals of Western civilization. He says the West is the best. Well, Lenin says the East is where it's at. The East is the future. It's the Eastern world. And socialism is going to be the Eastern world and the colonized world. It's going to be the rise of Africa, the rise of Asia, the rise of China, the rise of South America. It's the colonized people fighting for their freedom and breaking out of the West. That's the future. And Trotsky says, oh no, the West is the best. It's all about Western ideals. My Marxism is just a continuation of Western ideals. That is the difference between Stalin and Trotsky. And neocons agree with Trotsky. They are fighting for Western civilization. They are partisans of the West, as Irving Howe put it when he broke with Max Shachtman. As Irving Kristol put it, they are partisans of the West, fighting for the freedom of intellectuals. And their focus is on beating down the communists, beating down the Stalinist regimes of the East that would challenge the hegemony of the West. And they're intellectuals and writers who realized they could advance their careers and they could get nice paychecks to write books, mobilizing on the basis of their revolutionary and leftist ideals, a crusade against Stalinism, against anti-imperialist states. They're the regime change activists of imperialism who base their ideology and their values on Trotsky and his misinterpretation of socialism. Now, why does any of this matter? You say, Caleb, this is obscure history. Well, I think it matters because at this point, the American people have voted over and over again and said in poll after poll, they don't agree with this. The USA shouldn't be destabilizing the world. The USA shouldn't be overthrowing regimes. But yet, our government continues doing it. Why? Because our deep state, the CIA, the FBI, the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon is staffed full of people who've been trained by neocons. John Bolton was never a Trotskyist. John Bolton was just a conservative dude, joined the military, went to college, wanted to become a foreign policy strategist, and he was studied Sovietology. In the 70s and 80s, there was a special field of study called Sovietology. At Harvard and Yale and Columbia, at the Ivy League schools, all kinds of people studied Sovietology. And the Sovietologists were trained by the neocons. The neocons trained the Sovietologists. Soviet Union, Marxism, Leninism was the model of an illiberal state, and the job of the United States is to go around overthrowing illiberal states. And the CIA and the FBI and the intelligence apparatus and the Pentagon are staffed full of people that got trained by Trotskyites and neocons. And their worldview, they believe the USA is on a mission to overthrow anti-imperialist states. And that's what they believe their job is. Well, the American people have said, we don't want that to be your job. We want our roads to be paved. We want good schools for our kids to go to. We want our water to be purified. We want our mail to be delivered on time. We want jobs and housing and education. No, we're not interested in your goddamn global crusade to spread the free market all over the planet. Anne-Marie Slaughter and your open international system and all that, take it and shove it. And the American people have said that over and over again. And no, we don't appreciate you telling us your noble lies about weapons of mass destruction. We don't appreciate that. We do not appreciate that. We don't want to be lied to. We don't want to be conned, and we don't want our tax money going to prop up your system and wage your crusade against every government you don't like. Jenny Lynn said it. Go to hell, Trotskyites. We're not interested. We're not interested in your permanent global revolution. We're not interested in your crusade. It's not what we want to do. We want a good life for our kids and a better future. And if that means we have to trade with Russia and China to do it, if we have to have a better relationship with the Eurasian countries, if we have to have a better relationship with Africa and Asia, we'll do it. We're not interested in spreading freedom at the expense of our children's lives and the expense of our country's future. We're not interested. We want a peaceful tomorrow. We want to get along with North Korea. We want to get along with Cuba and Venezuela and Iran. That's what the American people want. But our deep state is staffed full of people who think otherwise. And so there's a fight within the power structure. And that's why populism, that's why Donald Trump scares the hell out of them. Donald Trump has done a lot of bad things as president, no doubt. But Donald Trump tapped into that anger of the American people, that anger at the way that policies have been carried out for the last few decades. He very much appealed to people's desire to see the end of regime change wars. That scares them. They're scared of populism. And if you listen to them, the reason they did the Russiagate hoax against Trump and accused him of collaborating with Russia is because they see him as, like Putin, an illiberal leader, one of the masses of people, one of these governments they're trying to overthrow. That's why they compare him to Kim Jong-un. That's why they compare him to Xi Jinping. They view Trump as potentially illiberal and populist and building a mass movement, and they don't trust him for that reason. They tried to throw him in jail to keep him from being president, even though his first term in office, he didn't really do that much, but he didn't go in for World War III like they wanted. And if you think this stuff doesn't matter, ask yourself, why is it that in the middle of the 2024 election cycle, an academic from DSA, Aidan Beatty, ran a whole hit piece on Jerry Healy? I included in my new book an appendix about Jerry Healy. Right. And I've actually got it as a small book. It was originally a chapter in the Khrushchevism book in defense of Jerry Healy. Jerry Healy was a Trotskyist in Britain, but he supported Gaddafi. He supported Gaddafi. And the British deep state waged an operation against him. He supported the Palestinians. He supported Gaddafi. And they smeared him like crazy, and they called his organization a cult, and he's been dead for 35 years. But in the middle of the election of 2024, DSA published a smear piece against Jerry Healy, because Jerry Healy is the prototype for the kind of movement they're scared of. Right? Jerry Healy was a guy who built a very effective organization in Britain that supported the Palestinians. And one of Jerry Healy's followers won an Oscar, Vanessa Redgrave. And at the Oscars, she got up and she said, she called out Zionist thugs and hoodlums, and she supported the Palestinians at the Oscars. And so Jerry Healy is the symbol of what they're afraid of an illiberal mass movement that would mobilize working people. And Jerry Healy was a good friend of Gaddafi. And so I included this essay in defense of Jerry Healy at the end of my book because it's about Trotskyism. And Jerry Healy was somebody within the Trotskyist movement who did the right thing and stood with Gaddafi and stood with the Palestinians. And 35 years after he died, Aiden Beatty and DSA are still trying to ruin his reputation because they know what it is. Right? This stuff is important, folks. This stuff is very, very, very important. Folks, I will tell you now, and I'm going to wrap this up. I can't go on all night. I'm going to tell you two stories. One story is 2018. In 2018, I started building the Center for Political Innovation. What was the first book we ever published? The Green Book by Gaddafi. Because my support for Gaddafi, my support for Libya, and my anger at the so-called left for failing to do so, that's a definitive position. So the very first CPI book we ever published was the Green Book, a special edition of Gaddafi's book with an introduction explaining the perspective, explaining why Libya was good under Gaddafi, his great achievements, how the left failed to defend Libya. That was the first book we ever published. And after CPI got going, I got canceled like you wouldn't believe. It became common knowledge I was a white supremacist. I went to New School University. The students at New School University had an occupation. They occupied the cafeteria to support the cafeteria workers and the union. I went there to support them. I was asked to leave. People are not comfortable with you here because we read on the internet that you're a white supremacist. I'm not a white supremacist. Well, that's what the internet said. It became common knowledge. I was a white nationalist. I was a white supremacist. I was a fascist. I was an evil person. And I lost friends like you wouldn't believe. People that I had slept over at their house. People that had met my parents. People who were at my wedding with me and my wife stopped speaking to me. Wouldn't talk to me. They would see me on the street and they would walk the other way because of what I did. Because I said that Trump was better than Hillary Clinton. And I said that the so-called woke left, their stop Trump derangement syndrome and their Russiagate hysteria was bullshit. And I worked for RT, and I'm proud to have worked for RT. I appeared on RT, and I'm proud to appear on RT. And I was on RT, and I didn't hate Trump. And I didn't hate working class people from small towns like the one I grew up in. And God forbid, I rediscovered my Christian faith. And I talked about Jesus and I talked about the Bible. And I was the enemy as far as these socialists were concerned. I might have been their golden boy during Occupy Wall Street. I might have been a great example. But when I wouldn't join the Trump Russia hysteria, when I wouldn't join their Stop Trump rallies, when I wouldn't, join their hysteria against Donald Trump and say all Donald Trump supporters are racist, when I wouldn't say that, that Christianity was evil, and I said I'm proud to follow Jesus Christ, and that Jesus, I never would have even thought about being a socialist if it wasn't for the Bible and Jesus, when I said that Libya was a socialist country and that dialectical materialism, this ideology that says there's no God, is a problem and I don't accept it, when I dared be who I was smeared and canceled. And it was a traumatic experience. It was an awful experience. I had a therapist that I saw. I'd seen her for 5 years. Twice a week, I had sat in therapy with this Marxist therapist. And we'd talked about all kinds of things, and trauma and pain. And one day she said to me, "Oh, you associate with Alexander Dugin. I can't give you therapy anymore." And that's illegal, by the way. She could have her license taken away. If I was really an asshole, I probably could get her license pulled. That's completely unprofessional behavior, but I didn't. And I lost somebody I'd been sitting on the couch and having psychotherapy with for 5 years, wouldn't see me anymore because I was a Nazi, because the internet said I'm bad, right? I was public enemy number one. I mean, you have no idea what they put me through. right? What the so-called Marxists, the cosmopolitan intellectuals put me through. They put me through a lot. And I am very thankful to this day. And I was looking through the internet, and I was looking for a sermon to listen to. I just wanted to listen to a Christian sermon. And I randomly found a sermon from a pastor who's long dead. And Gavin, if you're watching, you know exactly who this pastor was. It was random. It was a random sermon I found from this Southern pastor, a guy from Texas. And he said, don't change what you believe. Don't change what you believe. Sometimes you got to wrestle. Sometimes you got to withstand. And sometimes you got to stand. Don't change what you believe. Don't surrender. And, you know, it was weird. This guy politically I didn't agree with. I'm not an independent fundamental Baptist, but I heard this sermon, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. I swear God himself sent that sermon to me in 2018. When I was looking for a Christian sermon to listen to while I cleaned my apartment, I heard this pastor from Texas say, don't change what you believe. Have your loins girded about with truth. And it was exactly what I needed to hear. Don't change. Don't change. Wrestle. Wrestle. Stand. Withstand. And don't change what you believe. And I'm really glad I heard that sermon. And I'll tell you one thing. I've changed a lot of things, right? There's a lot of things that need to change because the world has changed. But when I was 15 years old, I believed that it was wrong for the U.S. government to invade countries and overthrow governments because their leaders were breaking out of Western capitalism, because their leaders were organizing the economy to raise people up from poverty. And you know what? I still believe that that is wrong. And when I was 15 years old and I sold newspapers, at that age, I believed that it is wrong. It is wrong to demonize Russia, that my enemy is not in Russia, my enemy is not in China, my enemy is not in Cuba or Iran, my enemy is in Washington, D.C., my enemy is on Wall Street, and the future of America's working people is standing in line with the people of the world in their struggle against the bankers and the monopolies. That's what I believed when I was 15 years old and sold my first newspaper. And you know what? I still believe that U.S. imperialism is the enemy of humanity, and the future of the American working class is breaking out of imperialism. And when I was 15 years old and I sold my newspaper, I believed that I was never going to be a coward and a sellout who'd say, I'm a socialist, but I don't want to be associated with that government. I'm a good socialist who supports U.S. foreign policy. I'm a good socialist who wants to destabilize and overthrow these countries. I still believe I will never be a namby-pamby sellout who supports U.S. imperialism and supports their wars and their lies and makes excuses and does leaps and backflips to say, oh, I don't support Gaddafi. I'm never going to do that. I am never going to cozy up with U.S. imperialism. I am going to fight for America's working families. I am a patriot. I love America. I love this country. And I know that the only future America is going to have is joining the Belt and Road Initiative, joining the Eurasian Economic Union, building the Bering Sea Bridge and connecting us with the explosion of economic growth that is happening in the Russian Far East right now, joining with Latin America, not threatening Venezuela with war, but doing business with Venezuela. The future of America is leaving the NATO alliance. The future of America is breaking out of the Wall Street, British Empire, London economic system and building and constructing. We need a national bank. We need to take control of our oil and our gas and our natural resources. We need jobs and education and schools for the American people. We need to pave the highways. We need high-speed railway, not bombs and drones and weapons and unemployment and opioids. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. That is what I have always believed, whether I was a Marxist, Leninist, or a communist or whatever. I have always believed that the war makers and the imperialists and the bloodsuckers that run this system and keep us in poverty to keep themselves rich and want to grind back the wheels of history, that they must be overthrown, and that to truly love America, to truly love my country and my people, is to stand in solidarity with the people of the world. That is what I believe. And if you want to call me a sellout and you want to call me a traitor, I challenge you to prove to me that you still believe that. Prove to me that you believe that. You stopped believing that. You abandoned what you believed. You joined Russiagate. You stood with John Bolton. You're the traitor. You're the sellout. You're the one who's abandoned what all this was about. You repeat lies about Russia. You joined their Trump derangement syndrome because they were afraid that Donald Trump wouldn't join their crusade. You supported the FBI and defended the FBI when Donald Trump went after them. You refused to stand with the Uhuru movement when they got their homes raided by the FBI. It is you who have betrayed your principles, and I am the biggest and most true fighter and believer in what you claim to believe in. You claim to believe in, but have sold out long ago. It is you who's abandoned it. And you've abandoned it because you're more loyal to your atheistic ideology of dialectical materialism. You're too busy waging a war against your parents and waging a war against God to stand for truth and justice on this planet and in this life. You're too worried about proving that no one can tell you what to do and that you're a free thinker. You're too worried about breaking down gender dichotomies and trying to prove how angry you are at Christianity and how much you hate the American flag. You're too busy waging a culture war against average working class Americans who vote for Trump to actually challenge the imperialists. It is you who have abandoned what all of this is about. It is you who are the traitors. It is you that are the sellouts. And I am the one who really believes what you've lied and claimed to believe while you suck the teats of this satanic system to do your woke bullshit. So let's just be clear about that. Let's just be clear about that. I have exposed you. The reason you hate me is because you are like a thief caught in the act, because you're frauds. You claim to oppose imperialism until Libya. You claim to impose imperialism until Trump is the lesser of two evils. You claim to fight for the working class unless those working people are Christian, unless those working people aren't woke enough for you. You're the frauds, you're the phonies, and I am the one who has kept alive what you supposedly believe in. And I am giving imposter syndrome to the imposters. I am exposing Marxists and socialists and communists for the frauds that they are. The very thing that the Bolshevik Revolution was supposed to do, the very thing that Stalin did when he built the Soviet Union and raised it up from poverty, the very thing that Mao and Deng Xiaoping did when they made China a strong and powerful country, the very thing that Gaddafi did when he built up Libya, that's what you're opposed to. You're neocons. You're Trotskyites. You want permanent revolution. You want chaos. You want instability. You are infected with the spirit of the ghetto. And you're more loyal to the spirit of the ghetto than you are to any of the principles that you claim to believe. And no, I'm not going to go away. You can throw mud at me, you can smear me, but I'm not going to go away. And on top of that, I'm going to keep organizing. People are joining CPI. We've had new memberships trickling in since the convention. People are joining us. This book is cooking, folks. This book is going to be hot, right? I just recorded with Kim Iverson, and I'm getting podcast requests. We're cooking. People are ready for this. It's only a matter of time. Wherever you go in this country, Americans know three things. They know that there's a group of rich people that runs this country that are waging wars that don't benefit us, and the power in this country belongs to a group of rich people who don't care about us. Two, they know that our freedoms, our American freedoms, are being taken away. The very things we've been taught are what it means to be an American are being taken away. And three, we know our living standards are going down. What we want is a government that'll stop these wars and stop sending our young men overseas and stop sending our tax dollars overseas. We want a government that will protect our freedom. We want to defend the Constitution and defend the Republic, defend our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, our right to own guns. Number three, we want a government that will take action to start improving our lives. We need jobs. We need good paying jobs. We need healthcare. We need education. And that movement a movement against the low-wage police state and its wars, against its attacks on our freedom, a movement demanding a government of action that will fight for working families. That movement is ripe. It is ripe to happen. And it's only a matter of time. We are boiling as a movement. We are growing, and people are seeing what we're about. And we're marching ahead. We're marching ahead. Only we can explain this. There's all this talk on the internet. People are wondering, what's the Trotskyites and the neocons? There's no other book that has ever been published on this topic. None. There is not a single other book. I've looked on Amazon. There's not a single other book about Trotsky and the neoconservatives. Why? Because only we can explain this. This is our story. We know about the spirit of the ghetto. We know why they threw Gaddafi out to dry. We know what this is about, but it takes our experience and our understanding. It takes innovationism, our new perspective. We're the only ones who can explain this. This is our time, folks. This is our time. It is time for us. We are in motion. No one can do what we are going to do, and we are here doing it. The times are crying out. Here's the rose. Now dance, and we are dancing. We are going to build a mass movement. And I ended this book, all the research and quotes from Shachtman and Aburn and James Burnham and all of that. I ended this book, actually, with a story. And I'm going to tell that story now to end my opening remarks. In 2012, a year after Gaddafi was killed, I was sitting in a diner in New York City. And there was a young woman who'd been around the party, and I was trying to recruit her back into the party. I already had the minority position about Libya, and she'd done some activism with the party. She was from a wealthy Arab American family. She'd done some activism with the party as a teenager. And, I was trying to convince her to become more active. And so we were having dinner in this restaurant, this diner in Midtown Manhattan. And we're talking about communism, about the party. This old man is in the other side of the diner. One of these lonely old men. You see lonely old men in diners a lot in New York City, right? There's a lot of older folks in New York City. They just go to diners to see people, right? They sit in a diner and read the newspaper all day or whatnot. So, we're sitting in the restaurant. There's an old man sitting there. He's got a cane. He's looking over at us. He's listening to every word of the conversation. And finally, he stands up very difficultly and makes his way over to the table. And he says in like a hushed voice, "Are you guys communists?" We said yes. His eyes got big. And he says in like the strangest, like hushed voice, he says, "My father was a Trotskyist." And I'm looking at the girl and we're trying not to laugh. I mean, this is like comedy. "My father was a Trotskyist." And we're like, okay. And that man then told me this story. And this story has stuck with me. And I will tell it to you now. He said that he was a young man when the Vietnam War was happening. And the cool thing to do when he was in high school was to go protest the Vietnam War. But his father was a Republican. His father was very conservative, lived in Manhattan, very wealthy, conservative Republican, wrote for Republican newspapers. So he did not tell his father that he was going to go protest the Vietnam War. So he went to a Vietnam War protest and he bought a communist newspaper. He came home and his father was looking through the apartment and found a communist newspaper. His father's deeply conservative. And he was quite nervous. His father's holding up the newspaper. And he's quite nervous. He expects his father is going to be very angry with him for bringing a communist publication into the house. And his father holds up the newspaper and bursts into tears. Bursts into tears, starts crying. And he and his father sat down on the couch, and his father told him about the best days of his life. And he was a young Trotskyite at City College, selling communist newspapers on the New York City subways. And he said that, yeah, they were naive, They were confused, but these were the best years of his life because back then he believed in something. And that even though they were poor in the Great Depression, they believed in something. And they went out and they believed that tomorrow would be better than today. And they believed that eventually the working class was going to come together and build a strong, beautiful society where no one was left behind and no one was hungry. And that even though his father was a staunch conservative, even though his father was a neocon, even though his father had become a hard right Republican, the best years of his life that he remembered crying had been when he had been a Trotskyite as a young man. And the reason I tell that story is because, I'm telling you, dialectical materialism doesn't get it. Because even as communist movements very much focus on dialectical materialism, no spirituality, there's always been a spiritual quality to what they do. Being in an organization, standing strong in your beliefs, having comrades, supporting each other and being there for each other as you go out and you build a movement. It is one of the most joyful things I have ever done. It brings me happiness. And I told that story at the beginning about how when I was 15 years old and they handed me a stack of newspapers and they said, go sell this newspaper. And I was like, are you kidding? But I realized that if that hadn't happened, I would probably not be living right now. I would probably not be alive. This movement saved my life. And it's not an intellectual exercise either. Not an intellectual exercise. This movement, believing in something, organizing, standing for it, learning about anti-imperialism. That's what got me from my little town in Ohio to Cleveland. That's what got me from Cleveland to New York City. That's what got me from New York City to Iran, to the Gulf of Aden, back to Jesus Christ, back to Moscow, back to Caracas, back to Beijing. I'm telling you, there is a spiritual power to all of this. And I would not be alive right now if it wasn't for what the spiritual power of being in a movement is about. And that's why I will not stop organizing. A certain personality a couple of years ago said I should stop organizing. Well, you might as well tell me to stop breathing. You might as well tell me to stop eating food. I am going to keep organizing. No matter how hard it gets, I am committed to building an anti-imperialist movement in America. Because that's the point. Philosophers have only analyzed the world, but the point, however, is to change it. And I'm going to build a movement. And that joy that man was remembering as he cried, that joy is something I've experienced. And that joy is what keeps me going. I'm in this movement for real. And I'm building this movement, and I'm never going to stop organizing. I'm never going to sell out. I'm never going to expatriate and just flee to another country and, live as an expat. No, I'm here because I love my country, and we're going to fight the low-wage police state. We're going to defend the Constitution and our republic. We are going to oppose the march toward World War III, and we're going to build a government of action that fights for working families. That is what we are going to do. And I am committed to building this movement. And it is because of my experience and my understanding that I had the ability to write this book. And I'm very proud of this book that I pumped out. And it's kind of convenient that my internet had problems this weekend. So instead of streaming, I was finishing it. And I hope you all go and read it. And I'm looking forward to all the podcasts and interviews. I'm getting all kinds of requests right now. You wouldn't believe it. All kinds of people want to have me on. Right? We're doing it right now. People are hungry for what we have to offer. The Center for Political Innovation is the movement that you should be part of. Dare to struggle, dare to win.